Hey guys, it's Olivie Blake, and this is me not writing. So I am joining you at 5 p.m. still in my pajamas. I've never worn them not completely unbuttoned with just like my boobs out for nursing. So yeah, in case you're wondering how my sleep is going, not well. I actually tried to do the pick up put down thing, and it was just an unmitigated disaster. I don't understand, like the instructions are like pick him up, soothe him, and then put him down when he stops crying. Okay, well, the thing is, he doesn't stop crying. The first stage is kind of like, he's like, meh. And then I put him down, and then he smiles at me a bunch. He's like, normally when I smile, I get a lot of attention. And then that didn't work. And then he just was inconsolable, full crab. Even when I was holding him, it was 30 minutes to calm him down. So I'm working on this. Like I'm working out my feelings on how I think I can proceed with all of this. It's just, yeah, it'll happen the way that it happens. Okay, so I'm in my pajamas. That's not why we're here. That's not what we're here to talk about. What has happened that is interesting? There was that really weird bad art friend article. If you haven't read it, you should. It's like totally unhinged. I'll put that link in here. Also, things I've enjoyed, the tour of Kirsten Dunst's house. Her house is like amazing. One of my favorite movies is Bachelorette, and she's exactly the kind of character in Bachelorette that I would want to write. Someone who's just like so unbelievably flawed, but for some reason you're still kind of rooting for them. Other news, I just recently did the My Mechanical Romance first pass pages. Sidebar, someone asked me about like how to get an agent, which is something I've talked about before. There is a video on it and there's a blog post on it. And then in a previous video, I talked about how I wanted to eventually do a video on the process of traditional publishing, but I hadn't gone far enough through it yet. First pass pages are like checking the design of what's going to be the book and plus more copy edits, and then there's going to be a second pass, and then yeah. I think like arcs are on the horizon after that. But anyway, so we're getting closer to me being able to like explain that if that's something you're asking. If you're asking about querying and stuff, that's something I've discussed before. It's not that exciting to talk about because the thing you end up talking about is how long it takes, because you just basically have to find someone who like vibes with you. And in the case of my agent, you end up in a really weird situation where she picked my young adult romantic comedy and ended up being a rep for someone who is an adult fantasy author also. So it works out that she happens to like that as well. But it's just funny how you get an agent based on one book and then they kind of just roll with the rest of your career, hopefully. That's an aside. Okay, so today we're talking about fan fiction. There's some easy and difficult questions to answer. So one of the questions I've been getting a lot is, will I ever write more fics in the future? The answer to that question is yes, but not in the Harry Potter fandom. This is something I've answered before. It's in my frequently asked questions. So, I mean, in the last year I wrote a Rebecca fanfic, as in like Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and I wrote like supernatural versions of Jane Austen's work. So I did a fairy Emma, a vampire Pride and Prejudice, and demon hunting Fanny Price. So if you're into supernatural Jane Austen, you can check that out. And that's something I would probably continue doing. I've talked in the past about how I really want to do a scene for Cushiel's Dart when Jocelyn, no spoilers for anyone who hasn't read it, but there's a cave scene that I feel like should be much longer that I would like to write. I also recently finished Avatar: The Last Airbender, like over COVID I finished it, and I feel like there's a missing scene that I would want to write for what I've been calling the Vengeance Field Trip, for Katara. So, there's things that kind of float around in my head that's like, oh, it'd be fun to write a scene for this or to, do whatever. But I no longer feel like I want to engage with J.K. Rowling's source material. It's just, there's just so much. A, I have my own work to do. B, if I wanted to work with someone else's source material, it's no longer her. Obviously, Harry Potter was a big thing for so many aspects of my life and my writing career. But I think it's just gotten to a point where, like, for me, I don't feel good about continuing to engage with the world now that I know what kind of mind it came from. And for me, it's just also that, like, I just feel that it's very, people are basically saying you're doing harm to this very vulnerable population, and she's just like, no, I don't have a lot of respect for that attitude. So yeah, so I won't be doing any more Harry Potter fan fiction. You're welcome to read what I have written. I will say that there's like my early fics, there's stuff I would change. I'm not going to because they're basically like time capsules. There's things I'm not like super proud of though, not even in terms of the writing, just things I would do differently. Just things I would do differently. 2016 was a different time. I feel like the sort of trope trends were very different. Discourse since then has sort of evolved, and I would approach things in a different way. But yeah, if you're like watching this because you like the Atlas Six and you're like, oh wait, she's written Harry Potter fan fiction, that's weird, maybe I should check it out, I would point you to Divination for Skeptics, or if you've got a lot of time, How to Win Friends and Influence People, which I think that is going to be the one that we end up talking about for our next question. There's basically two versions. So any tips on getting the energy from writing fics to translate into writing original stories? That's an interesting way to phrase that. Someone else just said, how did you transition from writing fanfic to writing original stories? So the thing with fan fiction is there's so much to learn from it. You learn how to please an audience, especially if you write the way I did, which was updating weekly, and like basically in real time. So I would write and post immediately. So you kind of learn how to serialize things, and you're writing, I call it episodically, almost like a TV show, as opposed to writing a manuscript where you can like go back and make changes. When you write a fic, you're kind of flying by the seat of your pants. It's like a great way to learn how to be a pantser. So you learn how to please an audience because you learn right away what people don't like. You learn how to be consistent with characterization. Whether people will say something is out of character or not is, that's kind of up to them. That's everybody's interpretation. But you do at least learn how to pick a characterization and stick with it, like decide what a character is like and build them out. You learn how to finish things. I mean, assuming that you write fic the way I wrote fic, which is to finish them. Learning how to finish an extended piece of work is a very important way to translate that energy. I think it's like that practice is really, really important, because one of the things that I notice about people who want to be writers but get like sort of bogged down in the actual writing process is because they just don't have a lot of practice finishing things. So fan fiction can be a really great way, because you're motivated to finish because you have an audience who's like, hello, what's next? Knowing that there are people following a story that can help you keep going, it holds you accountable in some way. So those are positives, but some negatives. You're working with someone else's source material, which means you get a lot of like unsolicited feedback that's like, that's not what this character would do, that's not what this character would do, you're interpreting this wrong, which can get kind of frustrating. I think my first step of like wanting to write my own stuff was I was sort of tired of feeling like fenced in by the rules of other people's interpretations. Another thing is that with fan fiction, you're really writing for tropes. You're writing for audience enjoyment more than you are for narrative coherence. So, or narrative cohesiveness, which is not to say that there aren't cohesive fan fictions, but you can please an audience by writing, coffee shop AUs that don't have a lot of plot, or don't have any sort of thematic significance, or don't have really like a lot of times there'll be a relationship arc, but not necessarily like a character redemption morality arc. So essentially, the storytelling, the way you're telling a story and the kind of story you're telling is different. So I think that I've said before that no matter what you write first, or if you draw or whatever kind of art form it is, the first thing you make is probably fairly derivative. It's an imitation of something that you have seen before. And then I think as you have practice recreating something, you begin to want to break the rules of that recreation process. So for me, there's a period in my fan fiction where you could see I was getting a little bit restless, because I was really taking liberties with what kinds of characters I was using or how I was building the world. Like Ride or Die is a pretty extreme Muggle AU. I used a lot of original characters in How to Win Friends and Influence People. 2017, 2018, Nobility is another one that's like just an extreme AU. So that's sort of my period of, okay, I am comfortable in this zone. I'm comfortable playing with these characters, but now I want to start to break the rules. And I could feel that in the way that my audience was like, this isn't what this character would do. I don't like this character. This character, like I normally like this character and I don't like them here. And it was because I was sort of, I think my characterization was accurate, of course, based on the changes to the world. But because I was making these drastic changes to the world, and I was basically dealing with a completely different version of that character, which a lot of people didn't like. And like I said, fanfiction is about pleasing an audience. So you're not trying to like qualify human existence or explain what it means to be alive in a fanfiction for the most part. I definitely did sometimes, and you can tell that those are the stories that people feel weird about. They either really hate them or really love them. Divination for Skeptics is a very good example of that. So yeah, and Divination for Skeptics is another example of the limitations of fanfiction in the way I built my characters, because, you know, I was sort of experimenting with neurodivergence with one of the characters. So I was leaning on aspects of her characterization that are not typically beloved in fan fiction. I mean, okay, we're talking Hermione Granger here, and there are a lot of people who, you know, because she's like the main girl of Harry Potter, a lot of people want to play up the, you know, more exciting parts about her, you know, extreme intelligence and her, the fact that she's very beautiful at the Yule Ball. Like, you know, we build her in a way that makes her very often sexually desirable, which is great. But I wanted to play with the parts of her that were like pretty problematic. Like for most of the series, she's a terrible nag. She has a really bad, like she really can't read the room in terms of social cues. And so I decided to kind of lean on those qualities, and in a fond way that's like, okay, well, what if we took this person who's kind of, she's a little bit on the spectrum, you know, where she like has a little bit of trouble seeing outside her understanding of the world, that she is extraordinarily logical, and this allows her to be, you know, excellent at school and not really so excellent at interacting with other people. And so it was something that I just kind of wanted to play with the textures of this character. And some people really like that. Some people really don't. Some people think that the sense of humor in the story is good and funny, and some people think it's just too far. For me, it's a comedy of errors. I just really went hard on the absurdity, and it's funny to me. That's what I was going to say about My Mechanical Romance earlier. I was doing the first pass pages, and I just started laughing hysterically because like I'm so exhausted, and also potentially it was the funniest joke in the world. Who can say? But yeah, it was definitely a joke that I wrote, so bear that in mind. But yeah, so for me it was sort of a transition period where it was like, all right, I'm writing a lot of original characters, or I'm leaning on characters that aren't canon characters, because I want to bring in this like, I always talk about texture, but you know, I want to bring in this kind of character in order to tell this kind of story. And I think once I realized that I was consciously making those decisions of like, this is what purpose the character has in the narrative, that's when you're starting to branch off from fan fiction, because there are lots of fan fiction readers who want to see characters just because they're beloved in that world. So I would get a lot of people saying like, why isn't Ginny Weasley in this story? And I would be like, because Ginny Weasley is not necessary to this story. That character is not like crucial to the plot that I'm trying to tell. But that's not really in line with the way that fandom works. So I think that was, which is again, not a criticism of fandom. That's me saying that's how I realized I needed to branch out and create something new, create something different. And I also, like I said, had a lot of practice working all the way through to the end of a story. And so to do that in my own world became that much easier because I had done it in someone else's world before. I will always have the utmost respect for fandom creators and fanfiction writers, because there is, so people often ask me if I have any formal writing education, or like you know, if I've ever taken creative writing classes or read any craft books. No, I haven't. 100% of my experience writing has been the practice of creating fan fiction. And it is irreplaceable because I wrote 4 million words of fan fiction that people actually read and gave me feedback on. And that is just, it's irreplaceable. I could do an MFA and not get that much feedback. So I have an understanding of what is strong or weak about my writing. I don't have to agree with what is said, but I have some idea because I had this just incredible platform of, if I wrote something, someone was going to read it, someone was going to give me some kind of feedback. Pick and choose who you take your feedback from, of course. You can't just trust whatever opinion comes across your AO3 feed, obviously. But that is just like, how else are you ever going to get that kind of essentially peer review? Obviously there's stigma against fan fiction because there are no gatekeepers. Anyone can write, which means there's a lot of terrible stuff out there. Of course. But the fact that anyone can write means that anyone can gain writing experience. And that is what I think is so valuable about fan fiction. And that is the thing that is like, I wouldn't necessarily say to come into fandom for the purpose of practicing for your writing career. That's not what I was doing. For me, it was just like, oh my God, other people have this opinion too. Great. I can finally write that like fix-it fic that I've been wanting to write since I was like a teenager. So that's just my little speech in favor of fan fiction. That's kind of like that's partially why I feel like it's a very elitist attitude to look down on fan fiction, because someone like me who didn't have a formal education writing was never going to get the education or experience in writing except for this thing that was free and available to me and available to anyone all over the world. That is just like, that's just such a beautiful thing. And I talk all the time about the sort of the collective imagination of fandom is a fantastic place to exist in. It's basically this like subculture of understanding, you understand something about fiction from reading fan fiction that you wouldn't get from traditionally published fiction or fiction that sort of follows genre rules and conventions. Fan fiction is about breaking rules in order to give people things they want to see: happy endings, tropes that are amusing, character, like different shades of characters that wouldn't normally be accepted in a more mainstream like media criticism discourse. In some sense, I think that if there are people who read the Atlas 6 and are like, there's something about this book that is unlike other things I've read, I have to assume that part of that comes from starting in fandom and having sort of a finger on the pulse of what a certain kind of audience wants. An audience who really values characters, because that's what fan fiction is. You can change the world, you can change the plot, but the characters are the soul of the work. And that is the case with the Atlas 6 and pretty much everything I've ever produced. Because to me, people are very interesting. And I've said before that the characters in the Atlas 6 are the plot. Essentially, their interactions with each other are the plot. And and that's something I think that comes from fandom. So I don't know that answers your question about transferring the energy. It is a very character-driven medium, but I think that what shifts is that you have to actually start to follow more of a, you have to start to purposely create arcs. You have to give the story direction that doesn't necessarily have to exist in fan fiction. That is something that comes with practice. Like, just as with anything, the first original thing you write after fan fiction, like it may not be that good, but it doesn't really matter because it takes you that much closer to the thing that is good. I wrote many fan fictions. I think I wrote like 15 full-length ones plus story anthologies of like hundreds of short stories in addition to my like 11 novels or something. So a lot of practice is what we're looking at here. So that's everything for now. And then, yeah, I guess we'll see you next week. I hope you're enjoying Affinity. I'm still very early in the beginning stages of it. But yeah, is there anything else I can say? I don't think so. Anyway, this has been me, Olivie Blake, not writing, and I'll see you next week.